Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book and DeKalb County Public Library, welcome to our third and final artist talk for the Book as Art, Volume 11, Myth and Magic. This exhibition of book arts is installed on the fourth floor of the Decatur Library, and gallery hours are Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturday from 1 to 5 p.m. and by appointment. I'd also like to take the opportunity to remind you that on October 30th, the closing day of the exhibition, will feature extended gallery hours, and we will allow you to put on gloves and look through some of the wonderful pieces on display at the library. A few things before we begin our official presentation this evening. If you would like to ask a question after the artists have finished their presentations, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature. You can find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. Click on it and a chat box will open up and you can type your question there so we can be sure to answer it in the turn. I'd also like to remind you that the closed captioning is turned on for this evening's event. You can find the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen, and when you click on it, you can modify the size of the font to make it easier for you to read during the presentation. We'll also be putting some links over in the chat section to the book as art, so you can see all of the wonderful pieces on display, as well as the artist's website. We would like to thank, of course, the Decatur Arts Alliance, the DeKalb County Public Library, the DeKalb Library Foundation, and the 3 judges for putting together such a wonderful show for us this year. Folk tales, fairy tales, and myths are foundational narratives that bridge the secular and the spiritual and merge the factual and the fantastical. Myths and magic transport us and bind us together in the world of imagination. This year's annual Book as Art exhibition explores these concepts visually through beautifully made volumes, sculptural and conceptual interpretations, and one-of-a-kind approaches to the book format. This evening, we feature 4 artists. Our first is Servane Briand of Palo Alto, California. Her work is ink ad aurum, which is a mulberry tree bark paper with ink and dyes from plants, paper thread woven with loom, eco-dyed silk, back with hanji. Next, we have Catherine Alice Michaelis of Shelton, Washington, who has 2 pieces in this year's show. The first, Fatal Fairy, is a side-sewn binding of botanical contacted printed papers and letterpress printed with wood type, hand-set metal type, and photopolymer images. And her second work is entitled Sola, a mythical story about a real girl, which is letterpress and pressure printed accordion binding with 1 folio pamphlet stitched at end. Our third presenter will be Shirley Ritter of Manhattan Beach, California. Her work is entitled Arachne, which is cotton recycled fabrics, various embroidery threads, and ribbon. Our final presenter this evening hails from Woodstock, Georgia. And Shackelford's piece is called Art in Surmise, and it's an artist book made from plexiglass and polyfill. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us here this evening to hear these wonderful artists speak about their work and their inspirations. And we encourage you once again to come to the Decatur Library and see these works in person. Right now, let's bring up Servane to talk about her work, Ink ad aurum. Servane?
Thank you. So hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight, and I'm especially grateful to Joe and Ali for such a wonderful exhibit. So thank you. Let me share my screen. I hope you can all see me. So a few words about me before we look at the book itself. I live in California, but as you can hear, I grew up in France. I came to the US in my early 20s, New York and San Francisco. I met my husband, who is French too and works at Stanford, so I moved to Palo Alto in 1993. I worked in various fields, high-tech, journalism, video game localization, consulting, and lots of freelance translation when our kids were growing up. Then in 2006, I took a workshop, and that changed my life. I studied printmaking and book art at my local community college, and with various mentors around the world. I was lucky to study fine binding with Eleanor Ramsey in San Francisco. I was an artist in residence in the CASP program in Palo Alto from 2014 to 2022, and recently moved my studio to San Francisco. So tonight I will focus on the book, which is currently on exhibit at the Decatur Library. But if you're interested in seeing more of my work, I quit Instagram a while ago, but I have a website which gets updated regularly. So this is the book, Hinc ad Oram. Why a title in Latin? Well, it's a reference to Ovid and an interesting expression that could be translated as from then to this hour, and gave us the French word encore. It tells us that something persists either by continuing in a similar manner or by repeating itself. And that's what the book is about, transformation and repetition. It explores transformations that occur between humans and plants in the form of a Zen bow structure. In Greek mythology and the Book of Metamorphoses by Ovid, the word of humans and the word of plants have fluid borders. Women get transformed into trees, men into flowers, babies get warm from a tree womb. So the book tries to bring these two words together. It tells the fleeting beauty of life and the stories of people transforming into plants who themselves get transformed to recreate these stories. I have a short video, which is not very high quality, but I think it will give you a better feeling for how the book works. So let me play it. So the book has a velvet cover and it closes with magnets. On the right is the one of the first botanical print in the book. It's printed on silk and backed with hanji. And it is a folding structure that you will see repeat in the book several times. Then there is a booklet with poetry from Greek contemporary poet Thanasis Atsopoulos. I will talk about it later, but the poem is translated into English and then into French. And this is digitally printed on hanji, the Korean paper. Then you have the first rectangular box in the Zenbow structure with another botanical print, again on silk. Then a few samples of the material used in the book, including the paper thread. So this thread is made out of hanji, and I will explain a bit more later too, and the same folding structure you already encountered once. And then the colophon, same folding structure, and again digitally printed on hanji, which has been hand dyed. Then we'll go to the left part of the book with the flower top boxes. Each of the 8 boxes opens, and inside is a piece of square shifu, that's made out of paper thread on a tiny square loom. And I will talk about that a bit more later also. A small rectangular tray with a reduced flower top box. A tessellation, flower tessellation made of hanji again. a close-up of the tessellation, where you can see the triangle grid, a folio with the name of all the people transformed into plants in the book of Ovid. And finally, the large box, which is again silk printed with plants. So the beautiful paper in this book was made in Korea by Master Samsin Kim, who started making hanji when he was 9 years old. As many of you may know, the paper is made out of the bark of the native mulberry trees. The photos here are from Mr. Kim's book. I got it from a Korean friend who works with my husband and happens to be from the same village as Master Kim. 2 years ago in Brittany, I met Michel Garcia, an expert in plants and natural dyes. I learned to create inks and dyes from local plants. Since then, I have been experimenting with paper and fabric in my studio. I read the stories of metamorphosis when I was quite young, and I remember they kind of scared me, even that of Philemon and Baucis. Being a tree grounded in the earth seemed very uncomfortable for the active child I was. But as I grew older, they made more and more sense. As I started exploring the field of natural dyes and botanical prints, I often went back in my head to these stories until it was time to explore them in a book. So I copied the stories of Ovid's Book of Metamorphoses with yellow ink on a very fine hanji, then made paper thread from it using the Japanese method named shifu. I learned it from Velma Boyard at PBI in 2018 and further in Hiroko Karino's book called Kigami and Kamiito. Here you see the paper cut into ribbons, and then the paper thread is spun and woven into small squares using a square loom. I didn't have the square loom, but I have an hexagonal loom I made for another project. And on the left is a picture of PBI. That's a close-up of the piece of shifu. Then I transformed some dyed hanji into flower tessellations. I explored tessellation for another project and learned a lot from this book. The process of folding the paper to obtain the triangle grid is extremely repetitive and requires precision before making pleats and twists to obtain the final shape. The zenshanbao, literally needle thread pockets, is a structure originated in China. Women would make them to store their embroidery threads and needles and small paper items. The tradition was extensively researched by Ruth Smith, who wrote a book about it. This is an article she wrote and was published in the British Origami Journal. The tradition was, it is also taught in the US by a wonderful duo, Paula Beardell-Krieg and Susan Scher, and I took their workshops with the San Diego Book Arts last winter. And that's one of the prototypes I made during the class. So the other essential inspiration in this book is the encounter with my friend Annie. She's a poet and a botanist and lives and works in Brittany, where I met her. She's on this photo from last July when we started playing with hanji, with paper. But for the book in the exhibit, I have relied on previous work we did with textile, mostly silk and linen. So the fabric was printed in Brittany for the book. Then back in the studio, I backed it with hanji, and it forms a larger box as well as a folded structure on the right side of the book. A quick note on the velvet for the cover of the book. In Brittany, traditional costumes often used much velvet with painted or embroidered floral motifs. The photo on the left is actually my great-grandmother. I decided to deconstruct one of my dresses to make the cover for the first book in the edition, and then found other sources for the next two books. Oops. As I was out of velvet. Finally, while researching this book, I stumbled upon the poetry of Thanasis Atsopoulos, a Greek poet and doctor. His poem Repetition is a Rule of Life resonated with the story I wanted to tell. He kindly agreed to let me bring his poetry into the project, so I made the booklet with the poem and added the French and English translation. I will let you enjoy the English translation. So the poem lives on the right side of the book, and it becomes an echo to the stories of Ovid. It captures the cyclical repetitions that define a world in which plants and humans coexist and constantly merge and make each other grow. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Servane. Next up, we have Catherine, who's going to talk a little bit about her work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine, and I'm going to share my screen with you now. Here I am. I'm an artist and the associate director of the Cynthia Sears Artist Books collection. I have been making artist books for over 30 years, beginning as a writer interested in letterpress printing. I currently live in Shelton, Washington, and it's a very small place, about 90 minutes south of Seattle. From the beginning of making books and doing printing, myth and magic have been themes in my work. I've been working for Cynthia Sears, who's a private collector of artist books, formally since 2020. I collect and curate for her collection, including curating shows at the Bainbridge Museum of Art's Sherry Grover Gallery, which exhibits a selection from her collection on view every day of the year. So if you're in the area, I hope you'll come by. Let's see. I have to go next slide. So one of the things I did when I first started working for Cynthia was I started this video program called Artist Books Unshelved, and it's hosted on the museum's website. I wrote and hosted the first 25 episodes, and while I still manage the production, Yucca Pets writes and hosts the episodes now. It's been a great opportunity to discover, study, and share artist books from around the world that are in Cynthia's collection. So I share that because this has just been an amazing time for me, being influenced, seeing a lot of work. And I think it's had, initially it was very intimidating, but then I think it's had a really good effect on my work. So in the opposite order that Joe shared the titles of my work in the show, I'm going to start with Sola, a mythological story about a real girl. This book was commissioned by the University of Washington for a show called Just One Look. About a dozen artists were invited, each of us given a text with a one look moment. They were submitted from the classics department at the university, mostly from Greek and Roman myths. But my assignment was a Northwest Salish story about a young girl who's been abandoned by her family. After much grieving, she's approached by a person or spirit who shows her where her people are, but because she doesn't recognize them, she's separated from them forever. I could relate to this story. I felt abandoned by my family as well, but I didn't want to leave the book with the sad ending of the Salish story. And I wasn't trying to tell the Salish story. I was telling my own story as inspired by this story. To not have a sad ending, I realized that I had to do some work and find the healing into my story. I've been using pressure printing processes for at least 25 years. I love its softness, which adds a lot of gentleness to working with this difficult subject matter. When titling this book, I wasn't sure if it was a mythological story about a real girl or a real story about a mythological girl. It's very autobiographical, but at the same time, my healing work has given me a lot of distance from these stories, which almost makes this seem like another person. So the myth and the real could be reversed because, as we know, mythic stories have kernels of truth. To capture the story, I thought about growth phases in my life and worked to represent them through one important moment. The book is filled with these from page to page. There are words that repeat a lot, like she knew this to be true, or she didn't know this to be true. It reflects the way in the original Salish story, what the young girl thought was true was turned on its head, and in the end, She abandoned her family by not recognizing them. Doing my own healing work included seeing my own choices to distance myself. This phrase, and then the other phrase that I think is often repeated is, it was everything Sola wanted to be. So the rock you see and this kind of swirling figure that you see, it will say, you know, this was everything she wanted to be. And I think that reflected how poorly I saw myself and who I was in the world. And so I latched onto other people's and ideas to discover myself. It's very strange to be talking about this book because it's so intimate and personal, and it's the first time I've talked about it in public. Eventually, I was able to see the world in myself and myself in the world through a transformative experience that left me feeling healed and whole. For me, this book is of most value for the healing it inspired me to work out. So that's Sola. My other book in the show is Fatal Fairy. Fatal Fairy is a book of alchemy and mysticism. I do a lot of alchemy with plants, but it's also about the alchemy of language and what were called the Black Arts, which used to include letterpress printing. Every other paper in this book, starting with the covers, are papers I dyed with plants, not ants. And you saw that process. Servane showed some photos of that. It's the same thing. It's often called eco printing. I call it botanical contact printing. Each piece of paper is different, and as they are individually wrapped with plants and simmered in water. So here's another cover that you can see. This is the title page. For the book, I created 2 talismans of my own design, drawing on symbols and plants significant to me. They are drawn in the sacred geometry tradition of using a compass and straight edge, and I had polymer plates made from those. I used wooden type, combining 7 sets of 2 words that share a root. This one shares the root ba, which is printed on the edge. On the backs of these pages are texts I wrote to explain them. Black and Beltane connected through the root that means to shine. Beltane because it begins on the eve of May 1st with a bonfire. Black comes from the coals of a fire, which also shine. For me, these 2 elements of the fire and the coals represent earth and fire, 2 of the elements of alchemy. This is Demon and Democracy. I thought I had another image here. Okay, this is the back of Beltane in black. And you can see now like an example of what the text will look like on the back of each one. This is the text of Grammar and Glamour. It gave me the opportunity to reference the Grimoire, a book of magical spells, of which this book is one. And Grimoire comes from grammar, which I found just super fascinating. This is an image of the other talisman I designed for the book. And this is the last image I've included for Fatal Fairy. I wanted to share a page from a newer artist book titled Becoming. It was created during a residency at a 125-acre reserve. It was just me and the plants and animals for most of 3 weeks. I loved it so much. I began printing from wood rounds. I did not change the shape of the wood, but was able to find really interesting pieces and shapes. The animal shape is Madrona, and I quickly saw it as me in my animal body as I worked playing with these prints. I began creating scenes with multiple pieces of wood, lino cuts, embroidery, and applique. Here I am in this image, gathering energy from the earth. I love this process, and it is still what I am doing, continuing to expand my techniques with design. I'm excited. I was awarded another 4 weeks at the same reserve next year, and I'm looking forward to what that brings. And then I just thought I would end with a picture of my studio. This is my studio in the summertime from the outside, surrounded by plants and flowers under the maples and cedars where I live. Thank you all so much for your time, and thank you so much for including me in the show and giving me an opportunity to talk about my work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much, Catherine. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to go ahead and start typing those in using the Q&A feature. And right now, we'd like to welcome Shirley Ritter to talk about her piece. Shirley?
Hi, my name's Shirley Ritter, and I live in Manhattan Beach, California. And I apologize, I do not have a PowerPoint because technology and I are not always the best of friends. So I thought I'd walk you through some of my process and how I make the books. And you can see I have some behind me. So first of all, I'm a military brat, and I moved all over the world, and I hadn't really thought about it, but this really informs a lot of the themes that you find in my book. I collect things because a lot of times we had to leave things behind when we moved because we didn't have the weight allowance. And I was always amazed at when I moved into a new house, there always was something left behind, always. And so that's a big theme for me. What gets left behind? You know, what things do you find tucked away in corners and closets? And I love collecting all these bits and pieces. So one of the books I have is this book right here. It's in a giant box, and it's made from recycled objects that I collected on my walks for a month because everybody leaves things behind. And as I moved around, libraries were always my safe space. So anytime I went to a library, I would find old friends and I would find new friends waiting for me. And this is where I really developed my love for fairy tales and for Greek mythology. And it's funny because when you go back and you read the books again as grown-ups, you realize how very bare bones they are. But I think that's part of what makes them so magical, because they really leave you a lot of space to fill in things for yourself and to make them very, very personal, which is one of the reasons I chose the story for my book. I'm going very old school here. Here is a picture of my book, Arachne, and it's backwards. It's a scroll book, so it's double-sided. And I love the myth of Arachne because Arachne, had the confidence and the audacity to challenge the gods because she thought she was more perfect than they were. And so they knocked her down a peg and turned her into a spider for her braggadocio. And this is why a lot of artists will intentionally leave a small mistake in their work sometimes. I always have small mistakes in my work. I'm not sure it's intentional or not. Military brat, then I majored in theater in college, and I've been a professional actress for over 40 years. And I've done it all. I've done plays and musicals and children's work. I've written plays, I've directed plays, I've costumed them, I've done prop making. And so I've actually made a lot of books that are included in shows. And this is where another theme of my work comes in. And the theme is, why not? I did improv for years. And one of the things you learn in improv is to always say yes to something, because the minute you say no to something, it stops that idea cold. Now, obviously, you know, along the way, you have to start culling ideas, but I try to always stay very open-minded and say, why not? Why couldn't I do something that way? Which kind of segues into my next part, which is, I didn't realize this, but I love the Dadaists so deeply inside of me. They challenged authority. They questioned, what is art? Why is art? What is the point of art? And I have carried that into my bookmaking. I love books. I love books as an object. They are so personal to me. I have hundreds of them, but I like to push the envelope with books about what makes a book. Is it just pages? Does it have to be words and pages? And I like to push the materials that I use. I use all sorts of things. I'm only limited by what I can actually technically work with. And I especially love working with fabric. Fabric is my deepest love. I know what I can do with it and I push it. I'm very fond of making scroll books. This one is an embroidered book about a walk that I took one day. As you can see, I just drew images and then I embroidered words and feelings over and over again. I have another scroll book that I created, and this one I actually wrote on pages, buried them for several months, and then dug them back up. And they were so decayed that you wouldn't have been able to handle them. So I very carefully stitched them onto more fabric. And I love the effect that that gives. So I love stitching in my books. Here's another fabric book that I created. This one is called, again, it's all backwards, I think, on the screen, Famous Redheads. And this is taking those bits and scraps. So these are all famous redheads in the world. And these are all just leftover little snippets from the floor of my sewing room that I have sewn into these portraits of famous redheads. And oh, I have another one. Another thing I like to do is juxtapose materials. So I have this poem that I wrote about stones, and I've sewed the stones into tulle. So you've got something that's very heavy and very sturdy, but I've sewed it into a fabric that's very, very delicate. And if you don't handle it properly, it could rip. This also brings up another thing that I enjoy doing with books, and that's having a sense of playfulness about it, allowing the viewer to touch the book, to see it their own way, because depending on how you scan this piece, if you start at the bottom, if you start at the top, or go left to right, right to left, the poem that is written on this will be different for every person that reads it. And I love that about books, that they can be so personal for me as the maker, but also very personal for the person who's viewing them. I have another book here that I've created, and it's a poem that I wrote, and you can read it either, it doesn't matter what order you read it in, it rhymes, and it's about birds and the sounds that they make. So depending on how you put it back together again, the poem will read very, very differently. But again, I love that sense of playfulness about it. I love, the textile, the touch of it, the feel of it. And I love actually, recycling things. These are old napkins that were going to be thrown away. And so I've reused them. And so all those things went into the making of my scroll book, Arachne. It is made from recycled materials. I have an old sweater in it that I, shrunk in the wash and cut up. And then I've just taken bits and scraps that I had in my fabric store, and I embroidered them and printed the poem that I wrote about it onto fabric and then embroidered over it. I used a photo also that I had taken of a spider web in my yard, and again embroidered that. So that is kind of it. I mean, the bottom line is I love books. I love reading them. I love making them. I think they're my favorite objects on the planet. So, nothing's better than reading a book and getting lost in its story. And thank you very much for having me on to do this. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a great opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Shirley. And of course, our last presenter this evening will be Anna Shackelford from Woodstock, Georgia. Anna?
Hi there, everybody. Like Joe said, my name is Anna Shackelford. I'm actually originally from Missouri, so I've got a couple of family members tonight watching this that are an hour behind us right now. But yeah, so I'm originally from Missouri. Let me screen share super quick, and I'll show you guys what I've got for you today. I'm super excited. So this book that I have with you guys is actually the first artist book that I've ever created. I never really put much thought into creating an artist book, but I'm currently getting my MFA at SCAD. And SCAD, of course, has their artist book competition every year. And that's when I kind of started looking into artist books because I never really heard much about them. So I'm excited. Like I said, I'm from Missouri. I'm one of 5 kids, so I've got a large family. I'm the middle child, if that tells you guys anything about me. I got my bachelor's of fine arts in painting from Missouri State University with a double minor in art history and museum studies. And I'm currently pursuing my MFA at SCAD here in Atlanta. And I have some of my fellow peers with me tonight as well. They're watching, so shout out to you guys. I spent my summer doing a bunch of different shows, a couple in LA and Kansas City, Raleigh, and Atlanta. And then now with you guys, this is kind of wrapping up my long stint of summer shows that I've been doing, kind of ending here in the fall. And then I'll be taking a little bit of a break to just create and then start getting back into it. So it is kind of a process. You guys know if you're entering into shows, whenever you're entering into the shows, there's a whole bunch of paperwork stuff that you have to go in with it. So about my work personally, if you don't know very much about my work and you haven't seen my artist book yet, which I'll show you here in a second, my work tends to be very colorful, imaginative, memory-based, and kind of surrealist inspired. I have always really, really identified with surrealist work. It's something I just love the idea of looking at something and thinking that you recognize something and then realizing that you maybe don't recognize it the way that you thought you did. I've always thought that's super interesting. And I'll show you guys a couple other pieces of just my work in general, because I am a sculpture artist, if that helps anybody too. Just so you know, whenever we look at my book, I am a sculpture artist, so that definitely influences what I create. But I'm going to show you guys a little bit of my other work just so you can get a little bit of a reference point, because I think that my artist book itself really references some of my other work as well. So my past work, like I said, I'm going to stop my share for just a second, and then I'm going to reshare on my website so I can just show you guys some of my other work. I'm going to go over to one of the project that you guys just saw in the picture that I had. So here's one. This is a great example. This piece, I use a lot of plexiglass and polyfill. I'm using needle felting with these. Like I said, they're sculptures. They're typically a lot larger. And I'm just going to be super brief with this because, again, this is about the artist book, so I don't want to get wrapped up in anything else. But just like I said, for a little bit of reference, here's the piece that I just showed you guys in that last slide. So this is really where you can see some of the surrealism. You can see some of the food items in this refrigerator that I've created that are kind of melting, or they're running down the side of the refrigerator. Lots of activation, lots of movement with this piece. This is a piece in particular where I kind of started to envision some of what I like to call lumpies is what I call them, which you'll see in my artist book with the plexiglass and the polyfill forms. My mom is actually the one who came up with the lumpies term, and it just kind of stuck. Everybody's liked it. It's a fun name. It sticks around. So here we are. So my artist book is titled Art and Surmise. Like I said, I didn't know much about artist books until I started going to SCAD, heard about their artist book competition, talked to one of my professors, and she had mentioned that artist books are actually a very popular thing, and it's kind of a long-standing tradition amongst artists to create an artist book of some version at some point. So if you're a practicing artist, you may create your artist book, you may create one, you may create multiple, but it's just kind of a tradition thing in the art world, which I didn't realize. So I thought that was cool. So I thought I'd start out. And like I said, I'm currently working in plexiglass and polyfill, but I'm all over the place. I'm also working in aqua resin and ESP foam. I'm all over the place right now. But what I was working with in particular at this moment, whenever I created this book, was the plexiglass and the polyfill, which is why I decided to go this route. Like I said, I started with the book. I knew I wanted to create an artist book, and then I wanted to analyze kind of my personal relationship with books, and then my relationship of the concepts, my visual, and then kind of come up with a visual concept and sketch that concept, and then eventually end up with the book that I have. I will go ahead and scroll through some of these photos. So like I said, it's Art and Surmise. This is actually rendition, I suppose, visually of a very popular art textbook that I used in my undergrad and in now my graduate program. This textbook is just classic. You see it around everywhere. So I kind of did my own version of that textbook and called it Art and Surmise, and then just kind of picked my own funky dates. And description. And then of course, on the bottom, you can see that it says Anna Noel Publishing. So it's all the text on the front is everything that I wrote. The only thing that kind of references that textbook is the title and then the box around. It's kind of an iconic look for them. The back of the text, I've actually got it pulled up over here. I'm going to read you guys the back of the text just because you can't really see it in photos. This is kind of one of those works you really have to see it in person. So if you guys are around in Georgia, definitely go check it out. But it is hard to read through photographs just because you get more of that layering effect. So the back of this book says, "This text contains nothing of any real importance. In fact, this book as a whole contains nothing of any real importance. Much like many of the textbooks of the contemporary era. This is not stated, of course, in a tone of malice, but rather observation of the period in which this work has been created. The integrity of paper has died, the influence of text has dwindled, and the morals of mental germination have been tossed by the wayside as shortcuts and time are valued above all else. What is the purpose of this book? Is there a purpose for this book? Is there a purpose for any book?" And of course, I wrote this not by any means, and it's kind of funny because it's like I wrote this artist book, and not wrote, I guess, entirely, but I made the front and the back, and I wrote this piece for the artist book, and I created this artist book. So I'm creating a book and appreciating books and reading. And of course, I don't have anything against them. I actually have a large collection of my own books about art in general. I've got lots of textbooks and everything. One of my minors, like I said, was art history, so I've got lots of books. I love reading. But I think it's very interesting. Whenever I was trying to come up with an idea of an artist book, I was struggling with the idea of just the difference even in my own lifetime. Obviously I'm very very young. I'm 23. Like I said, I'm in a graduate program, so I'm very young. But I think it's interesting to see, even in my own lifetime, just the transition from paper and physical materials and reading to then the Kindles and the Nooks and then iPads. And even what I just read that piece from was my iPad, which I use for school. And I don't even, like, anytime I get a syllabus for classes or anything, I'm not really ever getting anything physical anymore. Which I mean is a good thing whenever you think about paper and trees and cost of everything, of course. But it's just very interesting. It's very interesting to see that. And so I wanted to kind of analyze that relationship between books in general and where they were, what they used to be used for, and then where they're at now. And just text in general. Whenever everybody has social media and you can type anything up whenever you want and text anybody anything, it's like I feel like being able to have that constant communication with the outer world has also compromised the integrity of text in general, especially written text, because when we can type anything, send anything at the blink of an eye, I think it changes how we view physical text and physical books. So this book, like I said, this artist book, it wasn't created by any sort of distaste for books. I love books. Like I said, I just think it's an interesting relationship to observe. Of course, you can see with the books, I think this is all under colored lighting as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. This book, and with a lot of my other works, I tend to show with colored lighting. Whenever I send them off to galleries, they're not always shown with colored lighting. Sometimes they are if the gallery allows for it, if they've got the time or the effort to invest in that. I just use light gels and I'll cover the can lighting or whatever lighting that I have. But this is originally shown with the color, and I'll switch. Here it is just in a cool light. Your standard just indoor lighting, what you'd kind of be used to. It's definitely a cool light. It's not warm by any means. I think the work is best seen in a warm light, which is why I have it with the red one here. But there's kind of a comparison for you. The shapes themselves are needle felted. I actually I source polyfill now. I'll get recycled polyfill, which is it's like what they put in stuffed animals and stuff. Most people are very familiar with it. but the polyfill, and then I hand dye it on a big dye pot on my stovetop. And I'll hand dye it, and then I will let it dry. It has to dry for multiple days, even though it's just polyfill and it's plastic and you wouldn't think that it really holds water like that. Just I guess because of the way that the fibers bend and mesh together, it really takes a long time for it to dry. So the polyfill, once it dries, then I'll take it and I will needle felt it. And needle felting, if you're not familiar with that, that is a felting process in which you take one individual needle, very, very small. It's got little teeth on the end of it. So instead of just being a needle that slides in and out of something, it actually catches fibers and pulls them on their way out. So it actually ends up creating a mat. So if you needle felt something long enough, it'll actually end up being very hard, which I have a couple of small objects on my desk here. I'm in my home studio today, by the way. So I've got a couple on my desk here of just some hard shapes. You can make little shapes out of the needle felting, and it'll just turn fuzz essentially into a shape. So I'll needle felt these objects. As far as the plexiglass goes, I will have that laser cut, and I'll laser cut it, and then I'll assemble it together with a plexiglass adhesive that actually melts the plexi together, so it's very strong. And then I kind of, and this one in particular, this is an interesting piece just because I hadn't worked with the forms necessarily working through a closed space. I've always worked with these forms passing through, when I'm talking about the needle felted forms, passing through open space. So it's a lot easier to kind of manipulate. But this one, I actually had to leave the cover of the book open until I got everything set in stone. And then I sealed it off with that plexiglass adhesive. Because that adhesive does actually chemically bind the plexi together, there's no way to undo it after it's done. So it's not very forgiving, which is why I had to leave that front cover off. And then I went ahead and needle felted and then was able to squish them all together like that. I very much so worked to make everything look as if it were affected by gravity. I love the idea of gravity affecting shapes, kind of like I said when I had the influence of the surrealism. I love the idea of surrealist work, and I love the idea of droopy, melty items of some sort. Which is kind of where I ended up getting this. And I think it really relates specifically to the title of this artist book, showing just with the mythical and the magic. You know, it's like the melting forms, it's like they're growing, but they're not really growing. It kind of almost looks like a fairy tale. And it's just what I see in my imagination. This is how I view a lot of things. These shapes, the lumpies, as we call them, it's something that I view and see a lot of times just mentally. It's something that I see. I'm like, oh, imagine if, you know, if I'm looking at something out in the wild, not in the art world, but if I'm just looking at something and I imagine, I'm like, what if something were just, and I don't ever really know what it is. It's just, that's why I call them lumpies. They appear as lumpies. I'm like, what if something were just like climbing or growing right there? It's kind of related to plant life, I suppose, but I like the idea of something growing, but also still being affected by gravity and kind of melting and being surreal, and fluid, I suppose, is a good way to describe it. So yeah, so that is my artist book. I've had an absolutely great time talking about it. I've had a great time listening to everybody else talk about their artist books. It's such an interesting world to delve into, and I'll definitely be trying to keep in contact with some of y'all because I just love the idea of artist books and just the tradition that is behind them. I think it's very unique and very, very interesting, and I'll be following. So thank you guys so much for the time. I will turn it back over to you, Joe.
Thank you so very much, Anna. Once again, as we get to the top of the hour, if any of you all watching have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. But I did find a couple points very interesting, especially Anna and Shirley, when you think about books. And I usually tell the story every year that when we started to host the Book is Art at the library, there was a book artist that worked in plexiglass. So the pages of the books had no words on them. So Dot Moy, who started the Book as Art, and who was always a great guide for all of us before she passed, would say, it's a book object. We need to look beyond the text, which is why we still use that phrase to see it. But I think it's so very interesting that both of you, you know, who clearly appreciate and love books, use so very different forms and think about books in different forms. The scroll, things that are more, impermanent, like that tool piece as well. And there's also something about paper that is temporal. It can be destroyed easily and things like that. So, you know, how does that maybe affect the way you think about art, the impermanence of the book, how the book has really changed from, you know, what it was to now how we look at the book, you know, or snippets of the book, texts, you know, posts.
Yeah, no, I've thought about that a lot actually, because things get destroyed. You know, sadly, we see things destroyed all the times. I remember reading about the Library of Alexandria when I was little, and thinking, oh my God, that whole thing was ruined. And so I never create anything thinking that it will last for millennium. If it did, that would be amazing. But I'm more concerned with, you know, the creating of it, and then wanting people to use. I like objects that look worn and that look loved and that looked used. And I have gotten into discussions with people about my book. I do make books with paper, but a lot of times I don't, because I'm always like, I really do push the envelope of what is a book. And some people completely disagree with me, and that's completely valid. Like I said, I really love the Dadaist concept. When Marcel Duchamp put a urinal on the wall and went, that's art. And people are like, no, it's a urinal. And he's like, no, it's art because I said it is. And I don't want to be so presumptuous to say that if I go, that's a book because I say it is a book. But I just like to challenge the definition a little bit and have fun with it. For me, a lot of that is the fun, because I think with that Duchamp piece, that was fun for him. I think he enjoyed tweaking people, and I certainly enjoy the fun of having people look at that and go, wait, it doesn't have pages. You can't turn it the way you think you should. So, but I never expect anything I make to last forever. I don't know. It shouldn't. You should continue creating. We always need to have new things to see and respect the older things. But yeah, I don't.
I mean, I would agree, Shirley, in the sense that, I mean, obviously we don't expect anything that we create to live on forever, but it's also just, you know, if it did live on forever, what's the point kind of thing? Because then it's not as special, you know. And I think the fact that a lot of the stuff that we're creating is fleeting and there is a time limit on it is what makes it so interesting and so cool. And I just think it makes it unique for its time period. For everything, you know, anything that's created is unique in its own time, and I think it's meant to be that way, you know, which makes it fun.
I was inspired by Keith Smith, who in the back of one of his books talked about a book that you could only read once because it was on film negatives, and when you open the box, it would be exposed to light and everything on the pages would disappear. And this was over 20 years ago. And so I made a book on matches where I printed on the matches and I stapled 3 sets of paper matches in a matchbook, printed on the matchbook, and following the Dadaists, I put so the book was called Old Flames Mismatched. And I put names of my old flames, and then I put Lisa liked tiny things like mini skirts, but these were on different matches. And if you pulled off mini skirts, you got something else. And if you pulled off Lisa, you got a different lover's name. And so it was this way of mismatching my old flames. But what I really loved about it is that if you read the book properly by burning the matches, you only read the book once. But different people could have a different version of the book. So I think it's even fun to think about a book that you have to destroy to read or use up to read. I think it's a really fun and interesting challenge.
Oh, it sounds absolutely amazing. You know, granted, sitting in front of the shelves here, I may have a problem with that, but is a concept that's amazing as well. But, and Catherine, you know, hearing about your work and how personal Sola was for you, I liked how you all included something deeply personal, whether it was coming to terms with emotions, whether it was using a traditional costume to make a cover of the book, or, you know, shrunken clothing, found items. It seems that, you know, those objects spoke out to you in some way. Could you talk maybe a little bit more about that, and how maybe including something personal, like a traditional costume, like your own story, like a shrunken shirt, maybe makes the book have an emotional resonance with readers?
Well, I'll start. I love including personal items in my book. And the thing is, the people who read the books or who get them may not even know that it's personal. But for me, it's a way to sort of honor things. And it's also for a way for me to get things out of my house, because I am an inveterate collector. And so I will hold on to things. I mean, I have fabric that I've had since I was 8 years old, and I'm so afraid to use it. So my goal right now is to try and use these precious items I've been hoarding for my whole life and start to share them through books. But I don't know, there's something, because I stitch things. That's a very personal thing to stitch. I think, you know, hand dyeing, all of you did these very personal things, felting, the hand dyeing, using the wood prints. It's using your hands. It's so personal. And then if you add into that an object that you once owned or was a part of something you wore, it's like sending a little tiny sliver of your soul off with the object, I think. In a good way, not like the horrible way, like it's a piece of hair and, you know, now you're a witch and wah. But at least for me, that's how I do it.
When I first started making books, my work wasn't personal at all. And I think I started out just very shy and reticent to be personal. I was learning about the form and different ways to do things. And I think over time, it just became less interesting to me. And I was influenced by a lot of other artists who were using stories from their own lives. And I think that's what gave me the courage to be personal, is seeing how much I enjoyed those other stories by other artists. And I really do value the work of the hand, as you were saying, Shirley. That's really important to me as well. But I noticed that I just resonate with personal stories more.
Servane?
Yeah, I had an example of a book which was actually in last year's Decatur. So Joe, you may be familiar with it. It was a large, you know, book which is the kind of an biographical work. So very personal, of course. And I was reticent a bit, like Catherine said, about getting it out in the public. But it's a book that has about 50, 60 monotypes, and mostly using, you know, personal photos, which are all assembled and collaged and printed and worked on. But one day at an open studio, I had the book out, and a guy had walked in the studio, and he took me apart, and he said, you know, I don't know anything about art, but I saw that book, and now I understand. I understand so that was just such an instant, you know, reaction to something personal, which I think we experience all the time, you know, through literature, through tons of, you know, different forms of art. I was like, yeah, you know, don't shy away from the personal if you have a story to tell, because it will resonate for someone.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think everyone has a story to tell, but listen, I go out on stage every night and I cry in front of people and I do this, that, and the other, and that's hard. But I think the amount of bravery it takes to share something truly personal and a piece of art is the next level up, because you're putting it out there for everyone to see, and you know that people will say things, and what will they think? And you want them to love it, but you have to be prepared for them not to love it. And I think that's very, very difficult to make yourself that vulnerable. So, yeah, but those are my favorite kinds of books to look at, though, or the ones that are that truly personal.
Yeah, there's some amazing stories and interpretations of traditional stories and myths also. that are in the exhibition this year. Anna, looking at your whole body of work and thinking back to the previous two artist talks that we had, some of the artists worked in very large formats, and then because of COVID had to downsize. They were no longer had access to their studios, no longer had access to large printing equipment, and had to do small things by hand. Some artists, we enter competitions, and the work had to be a specific small size. And we talked about, what, how that either focuses your work, how that inspires your work, and how constraints can maybe bring something out in you or your art that you never did. And, going from sort of like that large refrigerator piece, and, you have then, your plexiglass book, which is smaller, but also clear. You can see completely through it. It's not a static object, so yeah, what, do you find working larger allows you to be bigger, or is sometimes working smaller giving you a little bit more, maybe focus and concentration?
That's a really good question. So a lot of times and I started with my undergraduate degree in painting, and this relates, I promise. But I started with my undergraduate degree in painting, and I got very bored very quickly because I realized when I just stood there and worked on one surface at a time, I got very bored. And so when I started to move into sculpture, I realized very quickly I liked what I have termed as a phrase of kinetic sculpture. I don't know that makes sense for what I'm trying to explain, but that's what I think of it in my brain as, is kinetic sculpture. And that means that as I'm creating, I'm moving around the object, I'm working on multiple parts at one time. Even right now, I'm working on like a 5.5 to 6 foot tall sculpture made out of plaster and everything. And I'm just like bouncing around it the whole time. And so whenever I do that, I think I tend to be more, I just like get to shut my mind off, and I'm just bouncing around doing my own thing and just kind of working on little things at a time. But whenever I work on something that's smaller, I do think I am more focused in a sense. I've noticed that I work on it typically for shorter amounts of time. And I'll just break it up into lots of little individual parts, because I'll work on it for a little while and then I get kind of bored and I'm like, okay, time to move on, and I'll go do something else and come back. But I do also think too, whenever I'm working on something that's smaller, it definitely makes me think about the details more, because there's only so much of it that you can see. When I'm working on something big and I'm bouncing from spot to spot, I'm just like jumping around doing a bunch of different things very quickly. I definitely notice I have to be more attentive to what you can see, because there's only so much that you can see, and it's all right there in front of you. And if you can hold it in your hand, you're going to be able to look at it a lot closer, and you're going to get to analyze it a lot better and spend a lot more time with it, just visually looking it over and everything. So I definitely think that it does change. The size definitely changes how I approach the project, and it definitely changes what I'm thinking about it at the same time too, for sure.
Catherine, Shirley, Servane, any thoughts on that?
I like.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Catherine.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I kind of work that way too. I tend to work smaller. The thought of making something 5 foot tall is overwhelming to me, but I bounce around. I usually have 3 or 4 projects going at the same time, because I get very bored if I stay just focused on one. So I usually have lots of things happening. So I completely can relate to that. And you're right. When it's the smaller it is, you have to start editing. You can't. And I actually think that's kind of good in a way, because sometimes I have too many ideas. And so if you work smaller, it really forces you to narrow it down and focus on what's the most important aspect of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Catherine, sorry.
No, it's fine. I like working small, and I find it amusing because I have these giant presses that are like a ton, and I'm printing little tiny pieces of paper on them, making these little lightweight things. So it's just this interesting contrast. But I think a lot of it for me came down to wanting to be just really conservative with a piece of paper and thinking about waste and how many prints you go through to get something right, you know, how much proofing, all of these things, what a mess I make with glue. And it made me want to work small because I just found materials really expensive. And so that's just what I think. It always worked for me anyway, but that reinforced it for me.
Servane, any thoughts on that before we sign off for the evening?
Yeah, I tend to push to as large as I can and as small as I can. The small, as you have seen in the shifu, is really small and tough on the eyes, but I think the going out of the regular size, for me, it pushes my creativity. So I agree with Catherine that the very large is, more expensive and more difficult, but, you get the rush of adrenaline because you can't print that many mock-ups. So you really have to get it right, which means you do a lot of mock-ups, smaller mock-ups. And then when you go for the really big one, you'd better succeed. And that, keeps me on edge. And the very small is challenging. And I like that too.
Yeah, I do have to say, in looking at your book, some of those very, very small folded pieces were found discoveries. It's like, oh, that's in there. And that, and I think when people get to see it, they all say that same thing, that they didn't know that very, very tiny thing was tucked in there. And it was a very nice surprise for them. Well, as a very nice surprise for all of us, this talk was absolutely enchanting and a perfect way to finish off the series for Book is Art, Volume 11, Myth and Magic. Once again, Shirley, Catherine, Anna, Servane, thank you for sharing your art and your process with all of us here this evening. Once again, if you would like to see the exhibition before it closes on October 30th, do stop by the gallery Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 1 to 5. You can also email us and make an appointment if those days don't work for you. And don't forget that on October 30th, we'll have extended hours and give you the opportunity to look through some of these wonderful, wonderful works of art. Thank you all once again for letting us into your homes this evening to share this with you. And we will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.